All right, I guess we will get started. So thanks everyone who's able to join today. If you are already kind of familiar with VBET, then this will hopefully just kind of be some helpful review. If it's relatively new to you, then hopefully you get some useful information. Obviously, it's hard to cover too much in a half hour, so this will be, kind of a crash course. Hopefully we'll have a little time for questions at the end, but if not, there's always avenues to reach out to us for additional information. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So today we're talking about our effort to map valley bottoms across the entire conterminous United States with the valley bottom extraction tool. So just as a quick overview, what I'll kind of cover in this talk here is just conceptually, what is a valley bottom? What are we mapping with VBET? How does the valley bottom extraction tool algorithm work? Then we'll cover this idea of sample frames within which we calculate metrics that can help us start to get at condition of riverscapes and recovery potential. And then we'll touch on the mapping and modeling effort of this CONUS 2025 initiative to map valley bottoms across the country. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the metrics that VBET produces and how we can use those to assess and understand our riverscapes or valley bottoms. So first, that basic question, what is a valley bottom? We typically define the valley bottom as the portion of the landscape that could plausibly flood by the rivers and streams under the contemporary natural flow regime. And another way of thinking about this, maybe from a little bit more of like a geomorphic perspective, is what's that area within which channels could naturally adjust and migrate over time if there weren't constraints that people place onto riverscapes like infrastructure. So looking at this image here, this is kind of, imagine you're looking from the top down at a riverscape. This tan color would be the hill slopes that abut the riverscape. In the green, we have active floodplains. The blue is the channels. This darker brown is a terrace, and this yellow is a fan. So we're thinking about the riverscape of this main stem river. That would not include the terrace. It would include the floodplain and the channel, and it wouldn't include this fan. However, if we're thinking about the valley bottom of this tributary, it would include this fan, because that's an area within which these channels are able to adjust laterally. So that's kind of, just a simple definition of what a riverscape or a valley bottom is. So this picture is kind of an oblique view instead of looking straight down. If we're kind of looking across a riverscape, and we can see over here we have the hill slope, and this kind of dashed dot line is what defines the valley. So that's the kind of the margin between the hill slope and the valley. But this part of the valley is actually a terrace, and the base of this terrace is what defines valley bottom versus just valley. And so this valley bottom, often, this is where you see riparian vegetation, and this is that area that could plausibly flood or within which the channel is free to migrate if there's not constraints. So why do we care about mapping valley bottoms? If you have engaged with much of our material in the past at all, then you've probably seen some version of this figure on the right that we like to use a lot. If you were to, walk up to this riverscape with no context and come down here and look at the channel and see something like this, you might mistakenly think that this is the valley bottom of the riverscape. And if you were to do that, then you would be missing out on a whole bunch of area out here that's been lost due to channel incision, that is actually riverscape that has the potential to be activated again and be recovered. So the reason we map valley bottoms is comes down to kind of this first principle of riverscape health, that rivers need space. So healthy riverscapes have space within which they adjust. And so the question follows, how much space do riverscapes need? And by mapping valley bottoms, we can answer this question of how much space any given riverscape needs in a healthy condition. Then that helps us answer this next question, which is, what's been lost? So that gets that idea of the anthropogenic constraints or things that are built within valley bottoms, or in cases like this figure here, when land use impacts have caused disconnection of the valley bottom via incision or whatever other mechanism. It helps us quantify that number, like how much of our valley bottom is still intact and how much of it's been lost. And then that helps us answer this third question, which is what's the recovery potential of valley bottoms or riverscapes? So of what's been lost, how much could I potentially get back via restoration? So the valley bottom extraction tool is kind of our automated way for trying to identify where on the landscape these valley bottoms or riverscapes exist. And it's essentially a topographic algorithm. So it's based on 3 topographic lines of evidence. The first being how far above the channel are you? So we use an algorithm called height above nearest drainage, which is essentially detraining a DEM to get at how far above the channel surface are you. The second line of evidence is slope. So valley bottoms tend to be flatter relative to other parts of the landscape. So we look at slope. And then the third is proximity to channel. So the closer you are to your channel, the more likely you are in the valley bottom. And this also helps to distinguish between those flat areas that are adjacent to channels versus those flat areas that are kind of up on ridge tops away from channels. So without going into too much depth here, the valley bottom extraction tool takes 2 inputs, a digital elevation model and a channel area polygon. And for this CONUS wide run that we're able to run across the whole country, we're using what's available nationally. So in this case right now, that's the National Elevation Dataset DEMs, which are 10-meter resolution, which is pretty good for mapping at this scale. And then we use to identify channel areas, we use the National Hydrography Dataset in HD. So like I mentioned, there's these 2 main lines of evidence, which is the height above the nearest drainage. So from the DEM, we derive, and the channel area polygon, we derive that raster, that's the height above nearest drainage, as well as a slope raster. Those 2 lines of evidence are then transformed into a relative likelihood of being valley bottom. So a raster with values from 0 to 1. And then those are combined to generate an overall likelihood raster that we then threshold at a specified value to extract a polygon that represents the extent of the riverscape. So yeah, Joe.
Jordan, is when you say that VBET is the input here is the 10-meter DEM and then the NHD, is that's how VBET has to be run?
Good question. So we use those inputs specifically for this kind of CONUS wide run because they're available consistently across the entire country. But the architecture of the tool is set up so that it could take any data sets that represent a channel and digital elevation model. So you could, for a smaller area of interest, use a hand-drawn channel if you wanted to, if you had a really, detailed version of a channel, and then LiDAR DEMs if you had those available to you. And so, like with most models, the quality of your outputs is determined by the quality of your inputs. And so you can trade off resolution for quality, and that allows us to run these for really big areas and do a decent job of it, or you can use those higher resolution data sets and do a really good job at a finer scale. So the way we transform those lines of evidence from values of slope and values of height above nearest drainage area to relative likelihoods is through these transform functions. So these are empirically calibrated with points that we gathered all across the US, and they transform values of hand and slope into likelihood using these functions. And there's different functions for different size streams. So you can imagine in really small, steep headwater streams, you're likely to see higher slopes in the valley than in real big lowland rivers. So that's what these different color transform functions represent. But in general, you see this pattern with height above nearest drainage. The lower you are relative to the river, the more likely you are to be in the valley bottom, and that drops off as you increase in elevation. And similarly with slope, the lower the slope value, the more likely you are to be in valley bottom, and that drops off as you get steeper and steeper. And these are the actual functions themselves. So once we have used that algorithm to identify the riverscape extent, the next step is to generate these sample frames that I'll talk a little bit about. So first we generate a center line for the valley associated with each individual stream. And then points are dropped along that center line at a specified interval that is a function of the size of the riverscape or the width. And the idea there is that you can maintain a consistent spacing as you scale up in riverscape size. So your smaller riverscapes are going to have a tighter spacing of those points. Your larger riverscapes are going to have a bigger spacing of those points. And I'll come back to one of the functions of these points in a minute, but continuing on, those points are used to generate Voronoi polygons. And those are then clipped to the extent of the riverscape. So in this picture on the right side, we kind of have this final product that consists of 3 different kind of sample frames. So we have the black lines, which represent the valley center lines. We have these yellow points that are the points dropped at specified spacing along those center lines. And then the valley bottom broken into polygons, these distinct polygons for the whole valley bottom. So what this does is produces several ways that we can think about information that we want to know about the riverscape and store metrics that can tell us something about that. So with the valley bottom broken up, we can calculate metrics within that space. So these individual polygons we call discrete geographic objects, DGO for short, because that's a discrete area within which we can calculate metrics related to riverscapes. These points we call IGOs, or integrated geographic objects, because we can use this point to store information representing any spatial extent we choose up and downstream of that point. So we refer to those as moving window calculations. So this figure kind of helps illustrate that. Here we have those sample frames, the points, polygons, the center line. And depending on what metric it is we want to calculate, it may make sense to calculate it at different spatial extents. So a good example of this is sinuosity, where if I calculate sinuosity, which is the ratio of my channel length to my valley centerline length within one of these polygons, it's always going to be pretty close to 1 because this isn't enough length of riverscape to really kind of capture that dynamic of the channel moving around across the riverscape. So in that case, I might want to aggregate several of these polygons together. So this pink kind of highlighting is showing using the DGO associated with a point, as well as 2 upstream and 2 downstream to calculate some kind of metric. So we refer to those as moving window metrics, and they're calculated by aggregating those DGO polygons and then attributing that information to the point at the center of the moving window. So just to show a couple examples of this, here's some information displayed on the DGO polygons. So this is just an arbitrarily chosen metric here. That's the proportion of the riverscape that is channel. And you can see this is calculated within each of those individual DGOs, and then that information is displayed using the symbology on those DGOs. So the darker blues represent, riverscapes where more of that riverscape area is channel, and the lighter polygons represent areas where less of it is channel. As an example of a moving window metric, this is one from VBET that is acres of valley bottom per mile. So kind of a measure of how much valley bottom real estate you have to work with. And that's one that you can calculate within an individual DGO, but it also makes sense to look up and downstream to get better overall sense of how much valley bottom space you have in that area. So then that information is stored on these points, but it represents some area up and downstream of each of these points in the calculation. So these sample frames become really useful. So you can pull things like the DGOs into your own assessment, and you can calculate what your own metrics that you think are relevant to riverscape health in your projects that you're working on. And we also use the same sample frames in all of the downstream models from VBET so that we're calculating those metrics related to kind of riverscape health, condition, recovery potential, all within those same sample frames. So the CONUS 2025 initiative was this effort funded primarily by the BLM to run the value bottom extraction tool across all of the conterminous United States, so the lower 48. And this is possible due to a tool that our collaborators with North Arrow Research have come up with, we call Cybercaster. So it's essentially this really cool cloud computing platform that allows us to run these models on virtual machines and do that at a huge scale. So where in the days that we ran VBET locally on a single machine, we could run one watershed per day, maybe on a good day, after gathering the inputs and preparing the data and running it. And so across CONUS, you can see there's almost 15,000 HUC-10 watersheds. And so now we can do that in a matter of days, where before it would take about a day to run one of these. So that enabled us to run it for all of CONUS. And as of October 3rd, this was the status. So 99.5% of the HUC-10 watersheds in the country had been run. The ones that are missing are actually a good portion of them are HUC-10 watersheds that don't have any perennial water in them. There's a few that have some other issues, but we're getting pretty close to completion for all of CONUS. So return to this idea of metrics that we can calculate within those sample frames represented by these VBET outputs. Thinking about VBET specifically, these metrics can help us answer just some interesting inventory level questions. So questions related to just what's there, you know, how much riverscape do we have across different geographies? So these types of questions we can answer with non-spatial, just tabular queries. All of our model outputs are stored as GeoPackages, which allows them to be, you can interact with them as if they were a SQLite database, and you don't necessarily have to open them in GIS and use them as spatial data. But because they are also spatial data, that allows us to do spatial queries that can help you kind of answer where questions. So it can tell you where in your watershed you might meet specific criteria that you come up with based on these metrics. And where we're focusing on VBET here, I'll just kind of touch on some of the metrics that VBET calculates. But again, to reiterate, all of the downstream riverscape network tools use the same sample frames and add additional metrics that can help you, that serve as lines of evidence to assess, you know, what condition your riverscapes are in and what's their recovery potential on those same sample frames. So some of the metrics that we get out of VBET are things like valley bottom width, acres per mile, or hectares per kilometer of valley bottom. So those are those just essentially help you do those inventory level questions of like, how much riverscape do I have? Where do I have kind of my wider valley bottoms where there's more potential for fluvial processes and maybe recovery potential versus where are the riverscapes more confined and have less space? And then one of the lines of evidence to kind of start to assess potential condition that comes out of VBET is this area and proportion of elevated versus low-lying valley bottom surfaces. So where our input lines of evidence are all topographic, this is based on essentially that topographic information. So we're looking at what are those lowest lying portions of the valley bottom that are kind of maybe more likely to flood, more likely to have riparian vegetation, more likely to be active versus the ones that are more elevated or more distal from the channel and less likely to be active. Again, this is just kind of one line of evidence that helps you assess that, and subsequent models and tools help add additional information into that. So along those lines, you know, these are kind of some of those big questions. What's there? What's there? What's properly functioning? And what's my recovery potential? So here we're looking at some VBET outputs. The white polygons here are those DGO polygons where the riverscape's been kind of chopped up. The blue is the channel The green is that estimated low-lying part of the valley bottom, and the yellow is that more elevated part. So this is just an example I zoomed in on to show where, in this case, much of what is classified as valley bottom here is both elevated and disconnected from the channel. This is an interstate dissecting the valley bottom here, and this is a railroad on this side. So this is an example of where a big part of the valley bottom is not active, but there's also not really recovery potential because there's these constraints, as opposed to an area where you might have larger portions of the valley bottom that are also disconnected or inactive, but where there actually is recovery potential because there's not constraints. So that would be somewhere where restoration might get you some improvement in riverscape health. So I'll jump here to just some examples of some of those kind of inventory metrics that you can get from these tabular queries of the data. Because we ran this for all of CONUS, you can ask these queries at these large spatial scales, which is really cool. So an example of one question I can ask is just the basic, what's the area of valley bottoms across all of CONUS? So based on our run of VBET to this point, it looks like there's about 1.24 million square kilometers of valley bottom, or 307 million acres. I could then ask, a subset of this question, which is, okay, so how much of that riverscape is perennial? Maybe I only care about working in perennial systems, or I want to know what part of the landscape has water all the time. So in that case, it's just under half of the total riverscape area. So 563,000 square kilometers, or 139 million acres. Another example here, what's the average low-lying valley bottom proportion across perennial riverscapes in Utah? So I create a query to ask this question, and I get an answer, 33%. So on average, in the perennial valley bottoms of Utah, 33% are that kind of lower lying surface. How does that compare to all of CONUS? Across all of CONUS, that number is a little bit higher, 38%. You can ask a question like, what proportion of the entire landscape is a riverscape or perennial riverscape? So again, for Utah, 9% of the area of Utah is riverscape. But we know here where we're in a desert state, there's a lot of ephemeral and intermittent channels. So actually only 2% is perennial riverscape. And if we compare that to CONUS as a whole, 15% of the landscape is riverscape and about 7% is perennial riverscape. So those are just some cool kind of questions that we can answer by having run this across the entire country that can give us some of that inventory level information. So then moving into maybe more of a zoomed in and spatial example of using a VBET output to actually inform some work that I'm doing. Here we're looking at the output that represents, again, acres of valley bottom per mile. So kind of getting at that question, where's there real estate? Where is there valley bottom area that I could work in? And the warm colors, the reds and oranges, are where there's not as much space, more confined riverscapes with less floodplain area. And the kind of yellows into blues are where you're starting to get more and more of that space, right? So just looking at this and kind of assessing it visually, I can see here's my main stem river. That might be kind of too big and have too many constraints to really consider working in. So maybe I'd be looking at some of these tributaries that have a little bit more real estate to work with. I could then look at that other metric I mentioned, which is the proportion of that valley bottom that's low lying. And that kind of gets me a first cut answer at this question of like, how connected or disconnected is my riverscape? And so again, the darker blues are higher proportions of low lying valley bottom. The more lighter greens and yellows are a lower proportion. So I could combine this information into a spatial query to help me identify something. So in this case, I'm going to ask the question, where do I have more than 30 acres per mile of valley bottom? So I'm kind of setting a threshold of space I want to have to work with. And then in those areas, where do I have areas that are less than 50% low lying? So where are these valley bottoms more likely to be impacted, and therefore where I could get some uplift with some restoration? So I'm using just a QGIS query tool here to write this simple query, and it filters my data down. So now I have kind of a few areas of riverscape that meet these criteria I came up with. Again, if I'm not thinking about the main stem, but more tributaries, I'm just going to zoom in on this area where I have this box. And you can see this kind of looks like that picture that we looked at on one of the first slides, where I have this, what looks like a pretty high and dry desiccated floodplain with upland vegetation, sagebrush. And then I have this kind of incision trench that might have a little bit of greenness and riparian vegetation and the channel down there. And so just kind of using this quick assessment with the VBET data, I'm able to kind of identify some of these impacted places where there's recovery potential to start doing some work in. So again, that's just a real quick example, and some of these downstream models that we'll probably talk about on another day have some additional information to help in those types of assessments. But I just wanted to show how VBET can start getting us in that direction. So where can you get VBET data? For anyone that hasn't been to the Riverscapes Data Exchange, I would encourage you to visit and poke around there. You can create a login and just start to look at all the data that's available there. This is where we have all the VBET projects. This link that I have here will specifically filter the data exchange to the 2025 CONUS run of VBET. And then, like I think I mentioned before, these are run and packaged at that HUC 10 extent. So if your project area is kind of at that scale or finer, then that's really useful to get the data. But if you're looking to do analyses over larger areas, there's a couple pathways we have of dealing with that. One that we're pretty close to having ready that we'll probably do a future webinar on, allows users to use other kind of custom extents. So you can upload or draw a polygon, and you're able to get back all of the metrics that we calculate in the Riverscape from VBET down through all the other tools. It doesn't include the actual polygons to see the Riverscape extent, but you get a wealth of metrics that are calculated with all these models. So something to kind of look forward to and have on the radar as we get closer to that. And we'll probably do a webinar to cover that when that's ready. So in summary, VBET is an automated way for identifying the extent of valley bottoms. It breaks those valley bottoms into sample frames that are used to calculate metrics that can help us learn something or make assessments about riverscape health and recovery potential. Helps us inventory what's there and look at the recovery potential. And at this point, it's essentially been run for all of CONUS, and the data is available in the Riverscapes Data Exchange. So thank you all for tuning in. We might have time for a couple questions. Just want to remind people too that as you dive into any of this, if you're kind of looking to use the data and have any sort of problems, you can go to riverscapes.freshdesk.com and fill out a ticket there to request assistance or report problems or anything else that comes up. All right, anyone have any quick questions?
And we'll spill into office hours here, so we can also stay over. We'll keep the recording going for as long as there's questions about the webinar.
Cool.
Looks like Kevin has a question about the perennial versus intermittent determined directly from NHD in this tool. Kevin, are you asking about or hinting at unreliability of NHD in terms of its ephemeral versus intermittent, or are you just asking in general?
Yeah, I'm just asking in general, although that is a fair point too.
Yeah, it is an F code that we use from NHD, and there is kind of one consideration is any like valley bottom polygon might have other channels in it. So the way VBET works is the primary channel or the largest channel is who gets priority over the valley bottom. So any other stream that falls completely within that valley bottom doesn't get its own valley bottom. So when we're coding the valley bottom as perennial or intermittent, it's based on that primary channel within the valley bottom. It doesn't account for other maybe tributaries or anabranches or whatever that fall within the valley bottom.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, Jordan, I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the degree to which you can use the tool for quantifying incision and what that kind of looks like. Seems like it really could be powerful in that regard, and what an awesome tool.
Yeah. So with the 10-meter data, it's pretty hit or miss how well you're able to pick out incision. But like we mentioned from Joe's question earlier, there is we've been playing around more and more with running this off of different resolution DEMs, and with the increasing availability of LiDAR, that's becoming more feasible. And when you run it off the higher resolution stuff, it's super, super powerful for picking up incision. Yeah, that kind of breaking out of the low lying versus elevated valley bottom, it jumps out really well when you use the high resolution data.
And then I guess I'd add a quick comment. I don't know if you've been in communication with Gary Whalen in the attempt to map nationwide the national stream assessment through National Fish Habitat Group. They do that every 5 years, and previous assessments many of us out west have been critical of, because they miss some of the elements that our streams and riverscapes struggle with, connectivity, water abstraction, etc. But a national data set like this would be extremely useful and powerful in that sort of national attempt. And boy, I wish they'd use this.
That's good to hear. Thanks for the info.
It's Gary Whalen, you said, Paul?
Yeah, Gary Whalen in Michigan, and he's always been involved in that national stream assessments through the NIFAP.
Cool. We'll try and look him up. If we can't, I might bug you, Paul.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Other questions?
I have a quick one for you.
Go ahead, Kevin.
If I can. Are there limits to determining the valley bottom as you move upstream into like higher gradient streams and intermittent and ephemeral reaches? At what point does the model fall apart is what I'm kind of getting at. And do you have any kind of empirical thing that suggests where we're at with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, short answer is where we're using for these national runs, the 10-meter DEM, that 10 meters becomes kind of our minimum mapping unit. So if you kind of interrogate these outputs and scroll up towards the headwaters, the higher you get into small confined systems, you just end up, your valley bottom is just a single pixel up through there.
Yeah.
Again, an issue that is somewhat addressed with the higher resolution data, where you can actually capture more of the nuance in those small systems, where you can see floodplain pockets and things like that.
Okay. Yeah. I was just wondering, related to that, we're trying to determine what exactly is the extent of a riparian area. And obviously that's somewhat of a loose term already, but this is a surrogate potentially for that. And then that question comes up as I move upstream even more. So yeah, this is cool though.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kevin. I mean, it is interesting. Jordan hinted at this on the clarification with, if you run this with higher resolution, both a channel input and a, LiDAR input, typically, if you're using a high resolution like a LiDAR, you're going to have to derive your own drainage network. And so then, what this uses as sort of its start or search area is very much dependent on the drainage area thresholds that you use. And the basic problem is, the LiDAR is so good that if you want it to pick up like a lot of small stuff, you go with smaller drainage area thresholds, and now you're picking up every little roadside ditch.
Yeah.
And then if you want, if you kind of coarsen that up to sort of filter out some of that, then you're missing some of the things you might care about. And so to get a quality input there, it often takes a little bit of hybrid characterization of that, but then the search pattern is just looking for the topographic areas. Your other comment about the riparian, I mean, this is exactly the motivation for, starting with a physically defensible basis for what's a valley bottom that could support riparian growth, is it's much better than just having, a buffer off of, which is what most people do, off of a poorly mapped channel network.
Exactly.
And so that's what RCAT, the riparian condition assessment tool that Jordan has developed that's in that tool stack, is attempting to look at. And there, the national runs are, just off of course 30-meter data, but with increasing availability of Sentinel and higher fidelity stuff, you can always run it with the higher fidelity stuff. What's striking is how good of results you can get considering how crappy some of these nationally available inputs we're using are. So
Right.
it's surprising. Cool. Well, any other questions? And we'll keep things on for just a more. I'll turn off the recording here, but we do have just regular office hours, which are for anybody that's working on anything with any of the Riverscapes data sets, and you just got questions. We're happy to sort of. Those are on 11:30 to 12:30 every Monday. So folks are welcome to join those. BLM's been very gracious in terms of paying for that and opening that up to anybody who wants help. But are there other questions or comments? Cool. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Jordan, for very nice, succinct presentation on VBET. We'll put the recording up. Nicole will send around a little announcement about that. And I also put in the chat, we are doing these short courses. The next one is actually on Riverscape health monitoring, more down at a reach scale, but the one that is coming up in November here that I put the link into, that one is going to be using a lot of these different models to try and play some of the screening and prioritization games that Jordan was alluding to. So to figure out, where in a catchment you may want to work for different purposes, or also just to, potentially say, hey, what is my riverscape? What are the characteristics of it? Where would be other riverscapes that have similar characteristics? What if I looked at that across condition variants, that sort of thing. So if that's of interest, info is there, and there's a growing set of resources that have documentation and stuff on this. So cool.
Thanks, everybody.